Sam is a lifelong nature lover and has been fortunate enough to conduct ecological field research in various parts of the world. He is a PhD ecologist, researcher and science writer, and has experience of working within the psychedelic field as a past scientific assistant to the director of the Beckley Foundation and currently as a research assistant with the Synthesis Institute. Oh, it's hard to say Synthesis Institute. He is also a collaborator with the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London with a research interest in the capacity of psychedelics to influence our connection to nature. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so it's great to be here. I'm going to be talking about the capacity of psychedelics to influence our connection to nature, our relationship with nature and the natural world. And yeah, before I sort of go into that, I'm going to define what it is that I mean by nature connectedness. So nature connectedness has been defined as a sustained awareness of the interconnectedness or interrelatedness of the self with the rest of nature. And so it can be considered analogous to the concept of biophilia, our sort of innate love of and connection to nature. And it's a sort of quite a complex sort of state of consciousness. We're made up of various facets. So there's aspects of cognition, aspects of emotion. It's a very much a personal, experiential, emotional capacity rather than something rational or knowledge-based. And yeah, the only way to sort of assess it is simply asking people. There's a variety of scales in use, and people tend that sort of probe people on different aspects of their relationship to nature, and they sort of answer and are scored on a sliding scale. And that's really the only way you can assess this, because it's a highly subjective, personal but powerful thing. You can't sort of put people in a brain scanner and have a look at what's going on in there. You're not going to find any answers doing that. You might find some mechanisms of ego-dissolution that might play a role, but you're going to get a very limited view unless you simply talk to people. Importantly, nature connectedness in broad terms is in decline, more or less globally. And in some areas more so than others, like particularly here in the UK, where I'm calling from. There was a recent study published earlier this year, and it compared sort of a mean assessment of nature connectedness with various other European countries, and the UK sort of came bottom of the pile, which is a bit depressing, really, along with we're considered one of the most nature depleted parts of the world as well. So we're not doing very well on any nature metrics, unfortunately. And it seems to be being eroded by a number of different things, partly through ecological degradation and biodiversity loss, species loss. So this has been linked to what has been termed an extinction of experience, which is a diminished potential for everyday interactions with nature. So as we lose more biodiversity, as our ecosystems degrade, there's simply less capacity for everyday interactions with non-human life. So that's sort of part of the story. It seems also electronic entertainment technology usage is kind of fanning the flames of that as well. So particularly in the young. So it's sort of being, eroded on a few different fronts. It's very important. That's a worrying thing. If we're concerned about mental health and mental well-being, this is something that should be of grave concern to all of us. This figure here was actually taken from a blog of a professor who leads a research group researching nature connectedness here, and it's from a study published last year. And what it found was that, and this study sort of looked at contact with nature, actually spending time in nature, nature connectedness, watching nature documentaries on TV, actually using nature and going out into it, and compared to just living by it. And what it found that was quite interesting was that nature connectedness was 4 times more powerful at predicting well-being than socioeconomic status, which is, you know, quite a finding. And obviously our connection to nature, like, is incredibly ancient, and far more ancient than the concept of socioeconomic status, which is a very new term, really, by which we sort of apply to ourselves. And another study as well, there's been a few different studies that have linked nature connectedness to different things like vitality and well-being and happiness. And yeah, one study published a few years ago found that nature connectedness compared to other big predictors, such as socioeconomic status and income and education, found that it was as powerful as predicting happiness levels as those things. So it's a very important determinant of our well-being and happiness. At the same time, and relevant to the times we find ourselves in, with biodiversity loss and species loss, climate change, all these things, nature connectedness is one of the strongest predictors of pro-environmental, pro-nature behaviors and attitudes. So it seems that as your connection to nature deepens, as a kind of side effect of that, your concern for it sort of goes up. And we can kind of see this in, various indigenous groups who live throughout the world. And there was a huge multi-country study sort of published a few years ago, assessing the state of biodiversity on the planet, like how it's looking, how the picture's looking. And the picture's not looking so good. Nature, wildlife, ecosystems are being degraded, eroded on a scale like never seen before in history, and that destruction is accelerating all the time. And without one of the conclusions of the study was that without a full-scale global mobilization on the scale of World War II to sort of challenge this, we're in deep trouble as a civilization, as a species. But one of the few positives of this was that areas that were inhabited by and sort of managed by indigenous groups were the only areas on Earth inhabited by humans that weren't declining and degrading. And part of that comes through the very deep connection to nature and the surrounding environment that these groups tend to have. And when that connection is very strong, you tend to view your surrounding environment and habitat as an extension of selfhood, basically. And with that comes the kind of the logic that, well, why would I inflict damage on my surroundings when it's just going to kind of reflect onto me or to us, to my community? And that's, of course, that's true. That's backed up by ecological science, which is all about the interdependency, interconnection of living systems. So it seems that with the progression of our civilization, which is taking quite a materialistic and individualistic and technologically oriented path, we've become ever more alienated and disconnected from nature, and we've unfortunately lost that intuitive knowing, and that's very dangerous, and probably one of the most unfortunate side effects of the progress of our civilization, which has made amazing progress in many domains. Certainly, but it has come at a grave cost as well. And this connection to nature that I'm referring to, this is only sort of a particular slice or dimension of connectedness as a broader concept. It's important to say. And of course, we are intrinsically like part of nature. So you can view it as as if we're disconnected from the natural world, as this quote alludes to here, we are in a sense disconnected from ourselves. Some interesting qualitative research conducted by my friend and colleague, Dr. Ros Watts, as part of the Imperial College Psilocybin for major depression research, where she sort of did some qualitative follow-ups of people who'd been through, had some psilocybin therapy sessions 6 months later. And one of the consistent findings she found across the board was that these people reported feeling that they'd moved from a state of broad disconnectedness, to one of greater connectedness. And that was connectedness to self, connectedness to other people, and connectedness to the world at large. And so, yeah, this increase in connection to nature that can come through psychedelics is not an isolated domain. It's happening on a kind of broad front, if you will. Just to touch on some of the psychedelic research that's been done so far. So this is very much a kind of new and emerging field still. And nature connectedness research is in general, actually, in the last few years, it's really starting to take off. But where the Venn diagrams of psychedelics and nature connectedness overlap is pretty niche at this time. This was the first survey study that I was aware of that was conducted by my friend and colleague, Dr. David Luke. And this was interesting because it rated the various different psychedelics and other substances that I wouldn't consider classical psychedelics. And it found that, psilocybin mushrooms appeared to be top of the pile in terms of their facilitating connection and concern, ecological concern. More research is required here to sort of, to better examine these relationships more vigorously, and that research is happening, actually. There's a collaboration going on now with David and another researcher, sort of delving into some more data on this to see, are there differences in the individual psychedelics. What's quite interesting here, though, if we go down to ketamine, ketamine is an inverse. It seems to do the exact opposite. So with this sample here, you're finding that ketamine is not facilitating connection to nature or concern for it. It's in fact very much facilitating disconnection and sort of, and disinterest and a lack of concern. And that might be because of its sort of dissociative effects. I don't feel like it's as simple as just being a synthetic compound, like LSD is a semi-synthetic, but it's doing pretty well there in terms of facilitating connection. So ketamine is not going to usher in the ecological age of Aquarius. Can probably say that. So looking at some of the other studies, there's been a few retrospective survey studies, one of which I was involved with at Imperial. And these have all shown that there's a connection between total lifetime usage of classical psychedelics and people's nature relatedness levels when assessed at baseline. But there's been some sort of slightly more, I guess, rigorous and prospective studies as well. And these have also found a link between particularly usage of psilocybin and increases in nature relatedness, which is considered basically analogous to nature connectedness. It's just a slightly different measure. And then other studies have also found positive changes to people's relationship to the environment and to nature. And an important point here is that these changes tend to be sustained. So in our sample, we found up to 2 years later, people reporting, they still rated elevated on their nature connectedness. And same with this other study assessing people's relationship to nature. This was sustained up to 16 months later. So this is an interesting thing because we're seeing now some of the clinical research with psilocybin, and some people who have psilocybin therapy respond really well. Others sort of the effect, the window of effect maybe doesn't last so long. It's maybe sort of like after about 3 months, the depression scores are starting to sort of creep back up a bit. So it seems here this is focusing on the nature connectedness area a bit more could be fruitful, because you're more likely to elicit sustained positive changes to people. And I think that's sort of that alone, given what we know about its links to mental health and well-being, warrants further attention. So this is just a snippet from a study that's ongoing that I'm involved in at Imperial. So this is, I feel like this will be a much more kind of rigorous bit of research that will sort of advance this area. And so this took healthy people who were psychedelic naive, so no prior experience of psychedelics. They had a blank slate, if you will, and they were otherwise healthy. And they were put through a few psilocybin sessions. I think it actually was just one for this study, a high dose psilocybin session. And they were sort of assessed on different measures, assessing various aspects of psychology and also, brain mechanisms. They were put in an MRI as well. And we found this sort of, there was this marked kind of jump in nature connectedness. And it was interesting, it was sustained. So, there was this kind of 3-month follow-up, and there'd been no decline whatsoever in people's nature connectedness scores. But what was interesting is having a look at the data more recently, and I probably can't say too much because it's not been submitted yet and gone through peer review, but we found that there was no drop-off between 3 and 6 months. And that's really exciting and interesting, because having delved into the literature and looking at various other nature connectedness interventions, so things like wilderness or nature immersion retreats, nature-based educational programs encouraging daily active engagement with nature over an extended time frame. These can all increase nature connectedness potentially, but they don't tend to be particularly long-lasting in their effect. Like I've sort of not found any compelling evidence for interventions that last beyond 3 months. So the fact that a single dose of psilocybin produce sustained effects still at 6 months post experience is novel and interesting, unlike anything I've encountered. Just to touch on ayahuasca. So ayahuasca usage, a few different studies have found that ayahuasca users tend to rate more highly in this trait of self-transcendence. And this is related to openness, to experience, and it encompasses sort of being open to or taking on board spiritual concepts in terms of feeling like you're part of something bigger or connected to the universe. And it's a significant predictor of both nature relatedness and pro-environmental concern. So this is a figure taken from a prospective survey study that I was involved with at Imperial, and we found a few things. So this graph here is showing, as mentioned before, the total lifetime usage of psychedelics against people's mean nature relatedness at baseline, and we found a very, very clear effect of total lifetime usage of psychedelics and people's nature relatedness. But we also found that after a single use of a psychedelic, there was also an increase in people's nature relatedness. We also found as well that ego-dissolution experiences seem to be positive predictors of of nature relatedness increase. And we can kind of hypothesize that when people have an ego-dissolution experience, particularly if they're in a natural setting, the perceived boundaries between self and other, or self and nature, dissolve and break down. And that can sort of potentially lead to this reframing or a perspective shift in terms of how you relate to sort of like the wider environment. And we also found that, yes, access to natural settings were also predictive, as one might expect, of increased nature connectedness following that session. And there's a few sort of just nice accounts here taken from the Imperial studies that kind of highlight how this connection might be experienced in the acute session itself. Before, I enjoyed nature. Now I feel part of it. Before, I was looking at it as a thing, like TV or a painting. You're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. And yeah, just to sort of touch on the different types of nature connectedness interventions that I mentioned. And so those kind of things that I touched on, they tend to sort of obviously require intentionality. So there's a prior intent to facilitate people's connection to nature or contact with it in a certain way. And they're time and resource heavy. And the research indicates the more time they take and you put into them, the more you seem to get out in terms of enduring connectedness benefits. And so we're talking here like multiple days or weeks. And I'm not sure how feasible that is on a sort of like grand scale. And again, there's sort of, these things can elicit increases in nature connectedness. I mean, it's kind of, there's a bit of a mixed bag. Not all interventions along these lines do or can. But the ones that do elicit change, I've yet to see any change that's sort of still really noticeable after about 3 months. And, like it tends to be after about 2 months, scores are sort of starting to come down. But we need more long-term assessment of nature connectedness interventions. And I feel like there needs to be more long-term focus, because I question like the value of short-term increases. I feel like the priority here is eliciting long-term increases. And this is where psychedelics can maybe be helpful. So as mentioned, even a single dose, high dose of psilocybin can seemingly elicit rapid, robust, and sustained increases in nature connectedness. These last at least a year or 2 years. And this is also very interesting and important. The psilocybin can elicit these changes when it's administered in a clinical nature-deprived setting, where the only sort of nature is likely to be human. There might be some, nice artwork or photography around, but I know from the Imperial College treatment room that I helped set up, it was a very nice room, but its purpose in that hospital setting was for immunocompromised patients. So there were very strict rules about what was allowed in there, and it was nature was not allowed beyond photography and art and stuff. So we did the best we could with that. But this is really interesting. There's no interventions that sort of have this effect in this domain. Like as mentioned, all the other nature connectedness interventions very much are nature oriented, as you'd expect. But the thing that distinguishes psilocybin and the other psychedelics is they can elicit these increases in nature connectedness without the prior intentionality of meaning to do so. And they do it in settings where there isn't that are basically nature lacking or nature deprived. And that's really quite mysterious and unique. There's nothing else out there that I'm sort of aware of, really, that can do that. And it might be a sense of like when you take a good dose of psychedelic, you're you're connecting to your internal nature, because we are all nature. Well, however aware of that or we are or not. So, or you're tuning into your internal biology as well. So when you're in the psychedelic state, you're tuning into the mechanisms of brain and stuff. So it doesn't matter if you expand outwards or go inwards, it's nature all the way down or up. And yeah, just to touch quickly on the aspect of ego-dissolution. So interestingly, in the sort of more recent study being involved in with Imperial that I mentioned earlier, we didn't actually find ego-dissolution as a predictor for nature connectedness increase, which was really quite surprising and interesting, because a few past studies have found this link. And yeah, obviously, so when you have a big dose of psychedelic, your ego, your subjective sense of self-identity that's thought to partly reside or be correlated with the default mode network, that starts to sort of relax. And that the ego is what has been evolutionarily bestowed on us to make us feel like we're individual and we're separate from the world around us, from the universe around us. And when that starts to sort of go offline, as I touched on earlier, it can sort of the perceived boundaries between sort of what is me, what is self, and the rest of the world starts to get very wonky and blurry. And it's sort of, when you're kind of in that state, those perceived boundaries between self and another kind of dissolve. And I don't think it probably matters. You don't have to be in a nature-based setting to kind of like feel that you've sort of expanded outwards. But if you are in that setting as well, I think it has the potential to sort of reframe how you sort of place yourself in reality. And that the memory, importantly, of that experience is powerful, and it stays with people and sort of informs that relationship from then on. So just to touch on a few different sort of aspects of the psychedelic experience that seem to play a role here. So the mystical experiences that people report under psychedelics. There's a recent study looking at people's first psychedelic mystical experiences by a Finnish research group. And they found that one of the most common effects, after effects, people reported as a result of their mystical experiences was enduring positive changes in people's relationship with nature. And so that's interesting in the sense that there's potential here for incorporating perhaps ecotherapy approaches after people's psychedelic experiences. And we should also note as well that there's a solid literature base to demonstrate that nature-based settings on their own are known for or prone for eliciting transcendent and mystical experiences. And at the current time, there's not really any use of nature-based settings to much degree, at least in clinical psychedelic treatment protocols. But it seems like sort of more incorporation of nature could be beneficial in perhaps sort of increasing the chances of generating mystical experiences, which are obviously very important for long-term outcomes. So we know that the mystical experience and the psychedelic experience can potentially increase measures of trait openness to experience and also reduce neuroticism. And I feel like this one effect of psychedelics to change personality hasn't quite got the attention it deserves, because the implications of the increase in openness and reducing neuroticism has huge implications for health, for mental and physical health. In particular, openness is linked to enhancement of aesthetic experience. People who are rate high in openness are more sensitive to, more tuned into, more appreciative of aesthetics. And aesthetics in nature, appreciating beauty in nature, is a pathway to nature connectedness, which openness strongly correlates with among the big 5 personality traits. And yeah, lower neuroticism levels as well is associated with greater psychological benefits following contact with nature. Psychedelics have also been linked to increases in mindfulness related capacities as well. And that's been found outside a kind of mindfulness meditation context. And this is interesting because nature connectedness and mindfulness appear to have a reciprocal and positive feedback kind of relationship. So if you increase one, you tend to increase the other. So just to touch base quickly on some of the other overlapping and potentially synergistic neurobiological and psychological mechanisms shared by both nature contact and psychedelics. Yeah, so just to sort of touch on connectedness again. So research has found that just simple acknowledgement of nature, taking the time to sort of tune into it and be aware of it, has interestingly not only sort of increased connectedness to nature, but connectedness much more broadly, connectedness to self and connectedness to others. So this is interesting because it shows obviously connectedness as a construct is interconnected itself. So if you focus on one domain of it or one aspect of it and increase that, you're sort of likely going to have reciprocal feedback on the other domains. And we know this as well from the psychedelics, such as Psilocybin, is that they also can increase connectedness on a sort of broad front. And yeah, we've sort of working on we've recently submitted a paper. My friend Ros Watts, who I mentioned earlier, has developed this scale, the Watts connectedness scale, that's built on her qualitative findings I mentioned earlier, that will assess connectedness in this broad sense, because currently there are all the scales that exist tend to take little snapshots of certain aspects of it, so social connectedness or nature connectedness, whereas this new connectedness scale will sort of be able to kind of like hopefully pick up on the change across the board. Awe is tied to that feeling of feeling very small in relation to something much greater than you are. And awe has been linked to a lot of positive psychological and even physical effects. And like nature and awe have long sort of been known to sort of be tied together, but it's also have been proposed that awe is a key part of the psychedelic effect as well, particularly the mystical type or peak experiences have been associated with eliciting states of deep awe. So it suggests that there could sort of be a synergy here. We know that both psychedelic experience, at least not necessarily acutely, because psychedelic experiences can be pretty challenging and not easy, but both those experiences and nature connectedness contacts are both they seem to buffer against negative affect or predisposition towards negative mind states. And interestingly, I think more research is needed here, but we know sort of one of the classic characteristics, if you will, of the psychedelic state is this increase in global brain connectivity. So within brain network, communication decreases in a local area, but globally across the whole brain, you've got different regions of the brain all sort of like linking up in quite a dynamic, fluid fashion. And it seems as well that walking in nature has a similar effect of increasing global brain connectivity. So sort of inferring from these findings regarding the potential synergistic overlaps here. What are the various, what can we do to sort of maximize enhancement potentially of nature connectedness through psychedelics, or the use of nature as a kind of therapeutic aid to psychedelic administration? And there's a variety of different approaches here. So the simple practice of nature-based journaling is something that's, I think, worthy of attention. So as part of the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin study conducted by Roland Griffiths and his team there, they looked at the effect of spiritual practices alongside psilocybin usage. And these practices included things like meditation, daily awareness practices using a mantra, and also journaling, journaling with a kind of spiritual focus. And journaling has been found to have therapeutic benefits sort of on its own, decoupled from this. But there's quite an interesting study showing that the simple act of recording things, journaling things that you encounter in nature, so anything that evokes emotion or a feeling of wonder or a feeling of awe or captivates you or intrigues you, sort of you'd simply sort of like make a note of that just in the form of the sentence. And in this study, participants were encouraged to sort of make 3 observations and recordings over a 5-day window. And interestingly, the control group here were told to do exactly the same, but they were recording facts. And that group had no change in its nature connectedness, which again gets across this is not a factual, this is not a scientific knowledge-based domain. It's something direct, personal, experiential, emotional. Whereas the people who'd been recording the things in nature that had captivated them or moved them in some way had this sort of boost in their nature connectedness that was still sustained at sort of 2 months post intervention. And this is obviously compared to some of the interventions that are very time and resource heavy. This is something that takes very little time, very easy and accessible to do. So I feel like using some kind of nature-based journaling alongside or either side of psychedelic sessions could be just an easy supplementary add-on. Shinrin-yoku, or Japanese forest bathing, is a sort of a really quite accessible, non-threatening, fun practice. I mean, it's essentially like an active mindfulness practice that takes place in a woodland nature-based setting. And the exercises are essentially designed to kind of get you to slow down and tune into the environment with your various senses. And so I feel like, yeah, perhaps on the sort of the integration side of things, the other side of the experience, it could be quite good. I feel like people say who've left the big city to go and drink ayahuasca or something in the jungle or, somewhere else, and then return to a busy, frenetic urban existence when their brains are a bit more kind of, let's say, raw and open and perhaps a bit more vulnerable. I feel like practices like this could be quite useful. Again, sort of going on from what I was saying about awe, there was a study published I think last year now by a group that looked at this intervention of awe walks. Again, very simple intervention taking up very little time. People were encouraged to, I think, have a 15-minute walk a week for an 8-week period, and people were encouraged to tune into their childlike sense of wonder of the world. And awe thrives on novelty as well, so they would tend to they would either walk in new places or seek out new things if it was a familiar walk that they liked. And they found that sort of over this sort of study time frame, people's levels of mental distress kind of went down, whereas their pro-social feelings towards others increased. And so I feel like, yeah, nature-based awe walks could be a good, again, supplementary intervention. We know from some of the research on psilocybin that not only does awe appear to be sort of a part of the acute experience, but feelings of awe and interconnectedness can persist beyond the acute session. So this is a way of maybe sort of, working with that in a beneficial way. Horticultural therapy, garden therapy. So one study that was part of the same study I mentioned earlier, conducted by David Luke, he found that in his sample, up to 50% of people took up gardening to some degree, which I think is quite nice, because I mean, gardening has fantastic like mental, physical health benefits. And my friend Ros Watts, we wrote a paper together sort of exploring these various different options, and she had a few nice ideas about how to incorporate horticultural therapy approaches. So perhaps before a psychedelic session, you could kind of like tend the soil and sort of like prepare a patch of ground, or perhaps plant a seed. So that, and then you can take this sort of like plant pot with this seed in and sort of nurture it, water it, care for it, as you're hopefully kind of nurturing and fertilizing the insights that you've taken from your experience, and hopefully you're watering them and seeing them grow. So the option potentially of walk and talk therapy. I know that this is an appealing prospect for some people, and I'm not sure that like the full clinical doses that are used in the studies now are sort of like appropriate perhaps for that kind of approach, but some people are very interested in the possibility of the idea of having a bit of a dose of a psychedelic and going for sort of a nature walks / hike with a therapist. And it's interesting that context has its own sort of differences compared to, say, the clinical approach. So, if you go for a clinical therapy session into a clinician's office, there's a sort of, there's a sort of slight power dynamic there, in that sort of the clinician is like behind their desk, or maybe not, but like you're going into their zone. Whereas in the outdoors, it's neutral. There's neutral ground. You're on a level playing field. And the outdoor therapists that are proponents of the outdoor approach like it because they feel like they get benefits from being in the outdoor space. And then the person having the therapy as well, they sometimes report that the outdoor space becomes part of the container, becomes part of the therapeutic process as well, that they can then return to self-soothe outside of the therapy context. So given that we know that psychedelics actively facilitate connection to natural environments, it seems they could be well geared towards this. I think if the sky wasn't the limit, and you wanted to go whole hog with this, and money wasn't a sort of an issue, I feel like you could maybe construct sort of psychedelic centers using biophilic design elements, so kind of imbuing nature into the structure itself, but somewhere quite beautiful in nature, maybe a mix of environments. So say a bit of woodland setting, maybe by the coast, so you've got sort of different beautiful natural settings. You could have sort of quite nice windows and a skylight, and so sort of people will be able to have views of around. It might be the sky, it might be the stars, it might be the trees, it might be the coast, so that at certain parts of the therapeutic process, depending on the needs and wants of the individual, you can kind of titrate the amount of nature that people are exposed to or want to have access to. And obviously, like, it's important just to mention that nature has its downsides as well. The clinical model that we know now works well because it's a container of essentially a container of safety. Like the setting itself, although tends to be a comfortable living room-ish like environment, doesn't actually play that much role in the experience, because people are wearing eye shades, they're wearing headphones, they've been briefed to like trust, surrender, let go inwards and look for any monsters, demons, and shine your light there and sort of confront them and stuff. So you've been primed to have an internal experience. and that's great, and that's important if you're dealing with or facing certain issues. You kind of, I think, need to go in there, and that's the way you're going to sort of do some psychological spring cleaning, if you will. But having or incorporating nature-based settings provides the option of a much more interactive psychedelic session, where the external setting is playing a much more of an important role in the experience itself. Now, the thing about nature is it's inherently unpredictable, and in a controlled setting environment, everything's under control. Whereas nature is more chaotic, more dynamic. So there's certain considerations. The weather is out of your control. You're going to have encounters with random humans. Is the wildlife and the mosquitoes going to like get in your grill? So there's certain things need thinking about in advance. But I don't feel like, in terms of ensuring safety of people, I don't feel like these issues are insurmountable. It might be that it would be good for people to have had a few psychedelic sessions maybe prior, before sort of having maybe the option of a more kind of earthy experience. But yeah, there's concerns that need thinking about and preparing for prior. So yeah, this is, as I say, this is a kind of new emerging area, and I'm sort of, as mentioned, I'm collaborating with Imperial on a study that I feel like will hopefully kind of advance this area in terms of the rigor and the strength of the results and the findings, and just the quality, and the quality of the science as well. So that's sort of kind of up in the air right now, but it is sort of happening. I'm waiting on my Imperial collaborators there. I'm part of another study group with Simon Ruffle and a few London-based researchers, and we're doing some research at an indigenous shaman-led retreat center in the Peruvian Amazon, and looking at nature relatedness there. And I'm also looking at doing some qualitative work with David Luke and his PhD student Alex. So there's a sort of a few different irons in the fire here. In terms of taking the research forward, I think there needs to be a more comprehensive study looking at the effect of different settings. So the prospective survey study that I was a part of, we did ask people, did you have your experience in nature, and did you feel like that was an important part of your experience? But that we couldn't, given the nature that it was a study survey sample, like we didn't have a firm hold on the types of settings, or clear picture of the types of natural settings people had access to. So it could have been a little garden, it could have been like pristine wilderness, and everything and anything in between. So I feel like to sort of more rigorously define the role of these nature-based settings, we'd need to design an experiment where we have kind of more control over the types of settings that people have access to. So yeah, this is just to say, this is a review paper I wrote with a few different collaborators, including Ros Rotz as my main co-author here, and was a big part of this as well. And this is an open access paper, and we sort of lay out here the kind of the research that sort of shows the overlap between nature, between the mechanisms by which nature contact and connectedness confers benefits to mental health and well-being, and the way that psychedelics do. So showing the overlap between them, and then sort of making the case for incorporating more nature-based content, practices and settings into psychedelic treatment models, and sort of making the case for sort of like focusing a bit more on nature connectedness, because I feel like right now it's good that it's being looked at, but it's kind of like a sideshow. It's sort of an interesting little sideshow, and I feel like, well, let's maybe bring it more into the spotlight, because I feel like it's worthy of that. So to hark back to the indigenous worldview, this this quote is from one of the founding fathers of the field of eco-psychology, and it kind of encapsulates quite nicely sort of the potential effect of being more connected to nature and the earth. And he said, if the self has expanded to include the natural world, behavior leading to destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. Nature contact, or the mental health benefits of nature, have been referred to as a forgotten ecosystem service. Nature, so a recent study found that the mental health benefits of contact with nature in protected areas worldwide each year is sort of in the ballpark of around $6 trillion in terms of benefit. Nature contact as a health-based intervention is hugely underused and undervalued, and there's a solid scientific literature evidence base now to show sort of its value. And I feel like by increasing nature connectedness, like one of the other effects that it has is people who are more nature connected tend to spend more time in nature. They tend to sort of value nature and sort of want to get out in it and do stuff, and that itself, without even considering the benefits of nature connectedness, is really important. There's a whole other broad suite of benefits that come through sort of engaging with nature and having contact with it. And given the situation that we find our civilization finds itself at this time, there is a notable lack of interventions that can sort of reduce people's environmentally destructive behavior. Nature connectedness, increasing that, seems to be a possible option here that might be able to help push back against this. So it seems like we'd be a little bit foolish to not pursue all and any avenues available to us to see whether, there can be something effective here. And I feel like right now, at this time we find ourselves in, reversing this growing trend of disconnection, of alienation from nature is hugely important in here. By pursuing this, the synergistic improvements, not just for human health, but for planetary health. And I feel like this was really nicely encapsulated by Albert Hoffman, who he came to view the psychedelics, one of a few of which he birthed into the world. He came to view their capacity to sort of reconnect us to the natural world as perhaps their most fundamental property. And he said this at the sort of mighty age of 101, shortly before he died. Alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. Thank you.
There's just been a few questions that have come through the chat. So the first one it says, the natural world often reflects contradicting values to those of humans, cultures, and societies. Is nature connectedness a wholly positive experience, or do you think there are dark edges?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I feel like mostly intrinsically it's positive, but what there is research to show that some aspects of nature connectedness are associated with anxiety and depression. And it's important to sort of have in mind that nature connectedness is also associated with psychological restoration and psychological resilience as well. So it has a potential mental health buffering effect, but it seems that it can also potentially increase people's anxiety and depression. I would think it's likely because people are more aware of environmental destruction and things like climate change and biodiversity loss and stuff. So people are more like raw and tender and vulnerable to that kind of thing. That might be for the individual, could potentially like a worrying thing. But I feel like, is that something on a population level that we want to kind of band-aid over? Because there's a reason. I wouldn't consider those feelings a kind of clinical diagnosis. I feel like it's a valid, sane and rational response to the damage and degradation to the living systems that underpin life on this planet. But otherwise, in terms of the literature base, I feel that sort of overall it's a highly beneficial thing to be more connected to nature.
And it's interesting to hear you say that those negative experiences or those negative impacts on mental health could be attributed to climate change, and seeing that play out rather than being just negatively impacted by experiences in nature. It's really interesting. This second question is really interesting and sort of carries on from, kind of talks about plants and their will and their desires. It says, are we stuck in an anthropocentric perspective in thinking that we are the ones benefiting from the psychedelic plants and fungi? Are these plants adjusting our will, our desires, and our thoughts for their own ends?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting, that's kind of the million dollar question, isn't it? And I don't know. I don't have an answer there for that. I feel like it's a very interesting topic. I have talked about this. I gave a talk at Breaking Convention, a psychedelic conference in London called Who's Tripping Whom? And it was all about this, actually, about how I was particularly interested in looking at, there's quite a few psychedelic species that seem to sort of thrive in areas of ecological disturbance or destruction or degradation. And obviously we know that they have this effect where they sort of make you more in tune and aware of that destruction and damage. And a non-psychedelic example that's quite interesting is the spices. Spices evolved capsicum to make mammals feel all hot when they eat them. Birds don't have those receptors. Birds are the chosen seed vectors for chilies, so they don't get the hot, spicy effect. It's meant to be a repellent, and yet humans have it, and they're like, oh, actually, I quite like that fiery heat sensation. I think I'm going to cultivate and grow this plant. But then that plant is then being spread all over the world and massively benefiting through that association. So it's like, who's kind of leading on who there? Dennis McKenna has made this argument that these sort of these psychedelic plants and fungi, they kind of act as a kind of global eco-immune system in a sense. But who knows? But another way to consider the anthropocentric perspective, flipping it back the other way, is that these plants and these fungi have been around for a very, very, very long time. Long before sort of humans were part of this world. We're a very recent development, really. 200,000 years modern humans have been around. We're the very much the new kid on the block. Whereas these fungi, these plants, have been around for tens of millions of years, or longer in some cases. So it's a really interesting topic, but I don't have an answer.
It would be great to see a recording from the breaking convention, if there is one about who's tripping who, it'd be great to see that. But also it sounds like there's more research and more discussions that need to take place in this space for sure. Okay, so we're up to our last question. In our over-commodified society, even with a psychedelic experience on board, is there a concern that our reductionist, value-seeking tendencies will pull the whole experience apart, desperate to find the one fundamental thing that makes it click, missing the broader connectivity that is perhaps a little more ambiguous?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there. As a kind of a bit of a side, I've written a review paper that's in review currently with a journal, looking at the various factors that predict and potentiate mystical experiences or peak experiences under psychedelics. And I am a bit wary of what I'm seeing in the psychedelic space of sort of, I mean, yeah, I can kind of get the arguments for, but also against, you know, some researchers are trying to kind of snip the psychedelic aspects of the psychedelic molecule out. And while I'm sure that there can be benefits through taking psychedelics with non-psychedelic effects, like I really feel that like a big aspect of psychedelics is precisely their experiential nature. And I guess modern medicine, modern science does like to sort of like reduce down into the component parts and sort of examine how those things might influence, or sort of what degree do they contribute to the whole effect. But yeah, psychedelics are very very multifaceted agents, and I'm sort of I kind of like subscribe to the kind of the holistic, multifaceted way that they act. I feel like there's various different benefits in various different ways. We maybe don't need to sort of like edit it too much or try and disentangle it too much. So I feel like I'm sort of, I do kind of share those concerns to some degree, and I hear where you're coming from.
It's a great sentiment to end on. Thank you so much, Sam, for your wonderful presentation. We look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.